The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. The content provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, financial, medical, or professional advice. All discussions of crimes, accusations, or legal matters should be considered alleged unless proven in a court of law. Always seek the advice of a qualified professional with any questions you may have regarding a particular matter. Listener discretion is advised. Enjoy the show. So welcome. Today I have a friend. I actually know this person in real life. He's awesome and he's written a book, and the book is called With Love, Mommie Dearest, the making of an unintentional camp classic. Now, it says here on the book you go as Ashley Hoff. I know you as Ashley. Ashley, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this. As we've talked about the subject previously, and I think we'll bring up a lot of interesting ideas and subjects that people probably had not thought about before when they thought about this particular movie.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, so because I know Ashley, I got the privilege of going to his book launch, which was awesome. First of all, it was at Book Soup in Hollywood, which I've lived here for over 20 years and have never been. So I'm happy you
On
gave me,
you.
right? For sure, shame on me. I should have made the journey because it would have been well worth it. That store is freaking awesome. So it's really cool you had your book launch there. But hearing you talk about your book was so freaking awesome. That was a really good night. The book, I just finished it, like 10 minutes ago. Yeah, it was fantastic. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it. And yeah, we'll get into the book and why we're talking about it on this show in particular in a sec. But do you want to tell the audience a little bit about who you are?
Yes, A. Ashley Hoff, as it says on the book cover. I grew up in the Midwest, and I actually had gravitated toward. I was a theater major at college, which was Columbia College in Chicago. But whilst there, I ended up interning at one of the talent agencies in Chicago. In a nutshell, internship grew to paid assistantship, grew to eventually becoming an on-camera agent with a different agency, moving out to Los Angeles, working at an agency out here. So I had met a lot of people in the business and also learned kind of how the business worked as far as, how television, how movies are actually made, as well as learned a certain respect for the people behind the scenes as well as in front of the cameras. I switched to writing because I got tired of offices. I don't like fluorescent lighting, not that this lighting is necessarily better
Yeah.
at the moment. And I wrote a book on the popular 70s TV game show Match Game, basically because a friend of mine worked on the show and I had told her she needed to write a book about her years working on the show. She said she didn't want to, but said, if you want to write a book, I'll gladly talk to you for it. And one thing led to another. She put me in touch with other people who worked on the show. And my first book, Match Game 101, a backstage history of Match Game, was born. That led to the current book, which is With Love, Mommie Dearest. I think one of the things that I've been able to do, a 70s TV game show like Match Game or a quote unquote, camp classic or cult movie like Mommie Dearest, these are very easily dismissed as kind of shallow or silly or whatever. But I think one of the things I've been able to do with my books is actually find the depth within the so-called shallow or otherwise seeming shallow appearance, and find the very serious issues that are at the heart of the various stories. A Match Game, for instance, game shows in the 60s and 70s really kind of paved the way for subjects like feminism or gay rights or civil rights, which were very hot button topics at those respective times. And you couldn't really address them in a lot of, living rooms, polite conversation without somebody getting riled up. So the game shows kind of introduced hot button topics into middle American living rooms, couched in the form of seemingly harmless fill in the blank questions and answers. And Mommie Dearest, which is, an unintentional comedy, or so it seems to a lot of people, for a lot of other people has been something they take very seriously because it deals with child abuse and how to overcome it.
Yeah. First of all, I had no idea that you had been an agent, and I've known you for what, 20 years? What do we talk about when we're hanging out?
Yeah, well, you know, a long time. I mean, when I lived in Chicago, especially, you couldn't really, if you worked in an insurance office or you worked, I don't know, at McDonald's, at Target, people say, oh, that's nice. You work retail. Oh, you work in an office, shrug of shoulders. If I said, oh, I work in a talent agency, all of a sudden people light up and they're all of a sudden very, very interested. And you get to a point where you don't really want to talk about work, no matter how pop culture-y it is or how I don't know, glittery and shimmery it looks. It's still office work. You're still glued to a telephone. You're still on the clock. So it's not always glamorous. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And so that game show, I also had no clue about the book about the game show. Can you just tell me a little time, what was that game show? Because I watched a lot of game shows, but I'm not familiar with that one. And then
Yeah.
also just tell me a little bit about how that touched on some of those taboo topics or those
Yeah.
more serious topics. Just a little bit.
Okay, well, Match Game. Match Game has had numerous incarnations. It started in the 60s, but in the 70s, it was the second run, which began in 1973 and ran to 1983. It's the classic version that everybody remembers with the set with the orange shag carpeting.
The sheep said, I don't want any more lambs. So I started taking birth control pills. By mistake, I swallowed a dozen buttons. 9 months later, I gave birth to a 6-pound blank.
Richard is being mean with me. He's acting as though I'm stupid.
She said a wool coat. What did you say, Dick?
I said sweater.
Sweater is good.
No buttons on it.
Question stinks.
Peter Perfect, Peter Perfect.
I bet you have a sweater.
It was a popular game show, and because of the 6 celebrity panel setup, it made for a lot of interesting banter between the celebrities. So in the years before reality television, this was kind of as close as you were going to get to see what Betty White was really like in real life, because the way she would be interacting with the others, or whatever other celebrities were on the panel on that given day. It was highly popular throughout the 70s run, but in 1996, I believe it was, the Game Show Network came out and they reran this show, these vintage period episodes. And college students and people who were just discovering the show for the first time, as well as old timers who remembered the show from its original run, were just glued to the set. They used to run it on the Game Show Network about 6 times a day. It was that popular, and it still runs today on Buzzer and is as popular today, 50 years on, as it was at the time. But in any case, as far as the topics like politics and so on, the game shows of the 60s and 70s, shows like Hollywood Squares, Match Game, and others were able to, because they had guest celebrities making guest appearances, they were able to have a lot of popular musicians or Broadway stars or television actors and actresses on. And a lot of them were either, ethnic talent or otherwise actors and actresses that might not necessarily be on a lot of mainstream television shows, except maybe in the occasional guest spot, yet would make regular or semi-regular appearances on Match Game. Rita Moreno, Scoey Mitchell, who is big comedian at the time. There were a lot of people who basically came onto the game shows, and they were, what today we would call people of color. And television, at least game shows, were not always as white as we assume television to be at that time. Mm-hmm. And so they would be on. And whenever Scoey Mitchell, because he was a stand-up comedian by profession, would be on, a lot of times the writers would throw in a racially charged question with which Scoey would, because it was prearranged, everybody was on the same page with this, he would be able to kind of react and interact. And it made for both humor as well as, just kind of softening these very hot topics. When I interviewed Scoey for the book, we talked about my favorite question and answer from an episode that he was on. And it was something in which, a character says, oh, this dollar bill looks really funny. Instead of having George Washington on the bill, it has George blank. So the celebrities and the contestants would have to guess George who. Well, at that time, there were a number of different choices. George Jefferson might have been one, because The Jeffersons was a popular show at the time on television. But Scoey, just kind of made a joke of it and said George Wallace, who was the Alabama governor, very much in the 60s, tried to thwart the rise in civil rights. And he made it very funny. He spelled it Wallass, which, pushed the envelope as far as censorship was concerned, but it was very funny. And Scoey had made the joke, had the old boy let me go to school when I wanted, I could have learned how to spell his name correctly. And of course, George Wallace had promoted segregation in education throughout the 60s. It was very funny, but it was a way of taking a very touchy subject, putting a humorous spin on it, but at the same time reminding television audiences, the audiences watching it at home, hey, by the way, these topics are real, they're serious. Perhaps you should, read the newspapers and learn how they're affecting people's lives. So that was the kind of stuff that I was able to address with the, harmless game show book. And with Mommie Dearest, it's kind of a similar thing. Mommie Dearest, the book, the original book by Christina Crawford, came out in 1978. Christina's mother, who was film legend Joan Crawford, had passed away just the year prior in 1977. And Christina wrote this memoir that was at the time very shocking, because of course everybody was still semi under the illusion that movie stars were perfect and Hollywood is a perfect dreamland place in which to live and grow up. And Christina's book suggested, no, that was not always exactly the case. It was a highly controversial book, as well as bestseller when it came out. That was, again, 1978. Film producer Frank Yablans purchased the rights and tried over the next couple of years to make a film of it, which he succeeded in doing in 1981. September of 1981, we're almost at the 43rd anniversary of the release of the movie. Mommie Dearest was released in theaters. It was supposed to be, it was a very lavish production. They spent a lot of money on it. It was a very handsomely appointed set and costume design and overall production design. It was a beautiful film to look at, with these gorgeous sets and the period costumes from the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was a alleged biopic of film star Joan Crawford and her very tenuous relationship with daughter Christina. And the movie, which was intended to be this awards-worthy, serious look at a very serious topic, dealing with child abuse, dealing with how to overcome child abuse, dealing with alcoholism, dealing with all this stuff. And the movie was released and it was seen as an unintentional comedy. Faye Dunaway was the star of the movie, playing Joan Crawford, and she was accused of giving an over-the-top, scenery-chewing, operatic performance. And, you know, she did. But ironically enough, that's what the part called for. That's how she was directed. But it was not received by audiences as it was intended. It was supposed to be a serious look at child abuse. And it was just, audiences were just sitting there laughing. And they found it very difficult to either take the film seriously, or for a lot of people, and this might be, I had a discussion with my agent, in fact, who at one point had seen the movie in Yugoslavia, which at that time was a Soviet satellite country. And he'd said that the audiences there, first of all, the movie theater there was packed, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Everybody was just crying their way through the movie because they took it seriously. I guess when a movie is either dubbed or subtitled, that tends to soften what we stateside see as flaws in the movie, and it becomes, you know, something they take seriously. Whereas here we say, oh, well, that's not very convincing, you know, that kind of thing. But I think sometimes, and I'd had this conversation with Eric, we were wondering if it's a particularly American trait that people get very squeamish with serious topics, like a scene where a child is spanked or severely, you know, hit with wire hangers or clubbed in the head with a container of tile cleaner or that sort of thing. I mean, there are some very violent scenes in the movie. And sometimes the way a lot of people deal with uncomfortable material is to laugh at it, either unintentionally or kind of as a mode of deflection, maybe to, you know, they can't really handle it. So they just kind of make it into a joke or laugh at it. And if you're kind of helped along by some risible dialogue in the screenplay, or by unintentional, you know, camera angles, or a performance that does seem to be over the top, you can just kind of zero in on that and just make fun of the whole endeavor. And just, again, it softens the blow. And it's very interesting because a lot of people who have watched Mommie Dearest have told me, you know, there are so many movies that people watch once, maybe twice, you know, they maybe on a flight and it pops up on the airplane, and, you know, so they watch it and this is the second time they've seen it. But there are a lot of movies that people watch once or twice and then forget about. And Mommie Dearest is a movie that people have watched repeatedly. There are people who've watched the movie 10 times. There you go. There are people who've watched the movie 100 times. It's kind of astonishing that this movie, again released in 1981, you know, 43 years ago, you can walk into any retail outlet selling movies. And even though there were lofty awards-winning movies released the same year, the Oscars for 1982, the Best Picture went to Chariots of Fire, a movie that everybody remembers the theme song for, but absolutely nobody has watched since it was released. And yet, Mommie Dearest, I can go into any retail outlet selling the movie, Blu-rays or DVDs. Chances are pretty good they've got it in stock on the shelves. And that's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
For a movie that was derided as a critical failure upon release and is still considered by so many people to be a flop or a cinematic bomb or something like that. But I think there are reasons why the movie is so popular. And it's not just the camp elements that you can read into it. A lot of people have watched the film for very therapeutic reasons. They are either, you know, identifying with Christina, the put upon child, the abused child, or they are identifying conversely with Joan Crawford as performed by Faye Dunaway. And, you know, they're kind of, you know, saying, drop the baby, throw the baby. You know, they're getting into this idea of, yeah, let's take out our aggressions by beating up on the kid and yelling at the kid. It's interesting because we all know that a lot of times the abused can grow up to become abusers themselves if they don't put a stop to the cycle. It's like when people have a lot of things put upon them, a lot of pressures, a lot of anger, they're the recipient of a lot of anger, they keep it within themselves, and it's of course boiling over, and they are in danger themselves of taking it out on somebody else and
Yeah.
passing the torch. And sometimes audiences seem to be doing that. They are either Team Christina or Team Joan, and they're sort of channeling all their frustrations or whatever they are wrestling with within themselves and just sort of projecting it onto what's happening on the screen. And it's very interesting. There are a lot of people who, either because they can't afford therapy or they don't necessarily want to or feel self-conscious about going to see a therapist, or for whatever reason don't deal with things on that level, sometimes they find other means to experience the therapeutic benefits of this kind of working through things.
Yeah, a couple of things. So I'm a person that's a big fan of the film, and I watched it a lot actually as a kid, which is really weird. I remember watching it on TV and her saying the F word, and I was like, because that was on just regular TV. Like we didn't have, any paid channels or anything. And this was in the very, very early 80s. I was probably about 8. I think that's when I started watching stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I loved it so much. It probably had to do with the fact that it was the period and the costumes. Also, there's a little girl in it. I was a little girl. And then just to see this bizarre behavior, it really stuck with me. And I don't know. I'm the kind of person that likes to watch things over and over and over anyway, but I don't watch everything over and over and over. I watch very specific things, right? And this is one of those things. And when we went to your book signing and everything, our little crew got together and watched the movie again. And yeah, I still, even seeing it through the lens of it being a camp classic, I still was like, gosh, man, I can see why people think this is funny, but I never did. And I still don't, right? I'm not mad at anybody that thinks it is. It's just interesting that it never occurred to me, but maybe because I saw it young, really
Well,
young, and maybe
it's
that was. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's interesting because a lot of kids, sometimes people from abused backgrounds, sometimes not, discovered the movie on television when it would pop up in reruns or when it was showing on cable. And I think the smaller screen tends to camouflage the flaws better than, I mean, the big screen just blows it up bigger than life
Right.
in the most literal as well as metaphorical fashion. So you see all the flaws in place. The first time I saw the movie, I was a teenager. I'd already known of the film's reputation because you just knew of the film by reputation, but I'd never seen it until it popped up one day on cable as a rerun. And it was cut to ribbons with commercial interruptions, which actually cut out all the campy scenes. The famous wire hangers scene was there, but the bathroom sequence that follows was cut out. And the way it was cut, it looked like horror film to me. I mean, I knew it was supposed to be campy, but I just thought, oh my God, this is a horror show. And then when I sometime later saw the whole movie uncut, on videotape or DVD, I thought, oh yeah, no, I get the camp. I see it. Okay. So it's very interesting. There are a lot of people who just discovered the movie the way you did on television, and they just automatically zeroed in on the seriousness of the issue. Long
Interesting.
before I wrote this book, I had met Christina Crawford at an event, and we ended up talking about the movie, which she does not like, for one thing, because it's reduced her and she felt the topic to kind of a joke, and it's a topic, needless to say, that she feels very strongly about. But at the same time, she acknowledged that while she does not personally like the film, she acknowledged at that time in that conversation that its continued popularity actually helped make the message, that much more visible and universal. In the years since Mommie Dearest, her memoir, was published and the film version reached the screens, there have been a lot of laws put into place to help protect children that did not exist up until that point. And children today, as a result, are better protected. People overall are much more conscious of the difference between child abuse and disciplining your child. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people when Christina's memoir came out who got very defensive, and they said children need discipline. Otherwise, you'll have them running around and be spoiled brats. And that was not something that Christina was in favor of. She was not saying, don't hit your child when necessary. She was saying, don't hit your child because you had a rotten day at work, or because you made lousy choices in your life and you're unhappy with things, or you had one too many beer with dinner or whatever. That was a distinction that was really not made or widely made prior to the 70s, prior to the release of this book. There were people who really defended abusing your child because they made no distinctions between discipline, like solid discipline, teaching your child manners, teaching your child how to behave in public, teaching your child, how to comport themselves, but not, going overboard because you're reacting to something, or the child does something and you just can't help yourself and you just let loose and smack them around or whatever. We have so much going on in the greater socio-political world at this stage of the game, as well as in our daily lives, in our jobs, in our schools, if we are students, or for that matter, if we're adults who are part of the staff working at the schools. We deal with so much that brings out all of our short tempers or short fuses. And it's very easy for people, even in their daily lives, even when they're in traffic. Somebody cuts you off when the light is yellow and now you're at a red, and you just scream a lot of profanity, honk the horn, shout, scream, swear. It's so easy to react rather than just simply take a breath and say, okay, something's happened. I'm in the moment. I'm not thrilled. I'm not going to be pretending I'm not displeased, but it's just a minor little thing. It's not a life or death situation. So I'm going to let it go. And that way you can deal with the problem, whether it's another individual, a child, an adult, your coworker, the car in front of you. And you don't have to lash out. You don't have to act out. These kinds of things were not really discussed before publication of Christina's book and the release of the film. And I think no matter what you think of the movie, no matter what you think of its accuracy or inaccuracy, if you wish to believe that Joan Crawford was a wonderful, kind-hearted person, and there are many people who say she was, whether you choose to believe she has had a really, whatever was at the root of this very difficult relationship she did have with her daughter, a very push-pull, tug-of-war kind of relationship, whatever was the root cause of it, at the very least, it brought all this stuff into mainstream conversation and allowed people, gave people permission to talk about this stuff, to say, what if? And what if we handle things differently than, just a knee-jerk response? What if we are more considerate of children, thus teaching them certain things, how to behave without inflicting some sort of negative thing onto them?
Right.
I mean, there was a lot of serious stuff, positive stuff, that came out as a result of this silly movie.
Yeah. Well, do you happen to know what Joan Crawford's diagnosis were or would have been? Did that come in any of your research?
Christina Crawford has been on various talk shows throughout. I mean, ever since the book's publication, and in I don't know, like mid to late 2000s or early 2010s, she was on Joy Behar's talk show, and Joy Behar asked her, was your mother bipolar? Did she have a personality disorder? Or whatever. And Christina said, I honestly don't know because she would never go see a psychiatrist. There was a negative stigma attached at that time. She was also a movie star.
Mm-hmm.
People like that don't go to someone and discuss their problems or their personal issues. First of all, for fear that it's going to end up in the National Enquirer or whatever tabloid du jour.
Right.
But secondly, there was just a stigma attached. You did not seek help for something, or you certainly did not admit you had a problem that needed help seeking. So Christina said, quite honestly, she did not know, but she did feel that her mother was, in fact, an alcoholic. And that definitely contributed to, her rather lubricated temperament.
Yeah.
There's that. And you know, let's face it, no matter what your job is, but certainly if you're in Hollywood where you are seen physically and you're worried about aging or gaining too much weight or being judged for your appearance, we are all judged for our appearance just on a daily basis, even if we're working retail or work, whatever our job is, but it's magnified quite literally and metaphorically when you're appearing on the big screen. So there are a lot of reasons why Joan Crawford might have had the temperament that she allegedly had. And I quote a lot of people who both defend Joan Crawford and say she was a lovely person, she was lovely on set, as well as other friends of hers and coworkers of hers who said, yeah, she had some issues, and yeah, she was hard on the kids. So I let the reader decide the veracity of Christina's stories and her own memoir. Feel free to read Mommie Dearest, written by Christina Crawford, because I think it is an important book, regardless of your feeling of the way the movie turned out. But I do think that, again, because of it, we're talking about this topic. It's a subject that should be addressed. It should have been addressed earlier on. The fact that we have counselors who are properly trained in how to deal with survivors of child abuse. The fact that we have counselors who are trained in helping people who themselves realize I have anger issues and I need to keep it in check, and I'm finding it difficult to keep in check. That's the other thing. As I said, we all collectively seem to be under so many pressures on the day to day. We're getting angry at the traffic. We're getting angry because somebody misspelled our name on the Starbucks cup. We're getting angry about, a headline we read in the newspaper, and we're lashing out at each other, and we're getting online and taking our frustrations out when, somebody writes on Facebook, Hollywood Squares game show host Peter Marshall has just passed away. And, three comments down, somebody's having a fight about, the Democrats versus the Republicans, and, who won last night's debate and this kind of thing. And you think to yourself, okay, all of us collectively need to take a breath and exhale and just kind of be silent for a moment before saying another word.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because, you were talking about manner. First of all, manners. Where have they gone? Where have they gone? There seems to be a big overcorrection, I think, because I feel like the kids are now running wild. They've lost their dang minds, but that's a whole different subject.
I think a lot of it is, first of all, the past several years, because once the COVID lockdown happened and we were all kind of kept in our own little, commie cells, not really interacting with each other on a daily basis. I think once we, got set free out of our cages, all of a sudden we forget, because we don't have a guidebook in front of us, how to actually technically interact with other people. Our socializing skills have kind of gone out the window, because when you're safely behind a computer screen at the keyboard typing away, you can say and do whatever you like. Whereas when you're in line at the bank and someone cuts in front of you, you're not really allowed to just pull them by the hair, yank them out of line, step in front of them and,
Right.
spit on them. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but I've seen that kind of behavior and reaction happen over similarly innocuous things. And,
Yeah.
I think the more conscious we are of the way we react, as well as what we're seeing in other people's reactions, I think the better we're going to be collectively, growing as a culture. But also, I think just simply being able even to discuss these things
Yeah.
really helps.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't want to, especially when it involves kids. It's so uncomfortable for people to talk about. It's very difficult for people to talk about domestic violence at all. And then you include children, and then people really don't want to talk about it. So actually, I mean, it was a huge deal for Christina to write this book when she did. A
Oh yeah.
huge deal.
And she wrote the book not as a trained psychologist. At that time, there really wasn't a lot in the field of psychology dealing specifically with children's issues. I mean, I'm sure there had to be to a certain degree, but it was not commonplace. It was not commonplace discussed. It was probably more problem children were.
How are you going to collect data? Because if you want to do collect data and do a research study or whatever, you can't do like a control group of abused kids and non-abused kids that are in a cohort and then abuse these. You can't do that. So
Mhm.
first of all, it's hard to even collect data on something like that, even if you wanted to. Well, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the entire story, and I just have a note here to discuss them being left the zero in the estate, her and Christopher. I mean, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, Christina and her brother Christopher, famously, Joan Crawford had adopted originally 5 children, 4 of which remained with her. One young son was taken from her by his natural mother, when he was about 6 months old. So Joan essentially raised 4 children. Christina, who was the eldest, her slightly younger brother, Christopher, and then there was a big gap. There were 2 twin daughters that she'd also adopted. Those twins remained on good terms with Joan throughout her life. And when Joan Crawford died, she left the bulk of her estate to be divided between the twins and various charities. And Christina and Christopher were very famously excluded from the will, which said, something to the effect, to my daughter Christina and my son Christopher, I make no bequest for reasons which are well known to both of them. Neither professed to know what those reasons were. Apparently, that particular codicil or whatever, lines within the will had been in the will over many changes for at least a decade. So, whatever the root causes were, Christina did not know. She had kind of made up with Joan. Christopher never did. He never saw Joan after the 60s. But Christina thought that she and Joan had found a kind of rapprochement and had been on good terms. And then when the will was read, found to her shock, she was, left out of it. And there are a lot of people who said she wrote the book out of spite, as a revenge tactic, retaliation. That may or may not be true. The book came out the following year. She did not write the book before Joan's death. There were a number of people who said, oh, she'd been writing this book. She'd been planning to write this book for a long time, and Joan knew about it and excluded her from it. That is not the case. And there are a number of people who are major Joan supporters who say, no, the book came after Joan's death. Whether it was a revenge tactic or whether it was a way to make money off her mother's estate without getting the money from her estate, that's one of the among the charges leveled against Christina. I just think you don't make up stories about your mother just out of thin air, but no matter how much you envy her or resent her or whatever. And if there are reasons that you envy or resent a parent, I just think there's got to be a reason why you would feel that way. And that's my personal opinion. I can't speak to the veracity of every story in Christina's memoir. And for the record, the way scenes played out on screen is very different from Christina's book. That's one of the reasons she had disliked the film so much, still dislikes the film, because so many people accused her of lying about her mother. And then there were a lot of fictitious, made up scenes in the movie for dramatic purposes, because that's what you do with a movie.
Right.
You know, you can't exactly film life in a 1.5 hour time period. But I just think that resentments toward people don't usually come from nothing.
Yeah. Do you know anything about Christopher's life?
Yes, he'd actually passed away it was either 2006 or 2008 of cancer. He had had a rough life. He ran away from home repeatedly. You know, basically, he was sent off to boarding schools because he was considered a problem child. He was very rebellious, but by his claim, he felt that his mother had been very, very especially strict and abusive with him. And Christina had basically said that Joan Crawford did not really like men that much due to her own either background or interpersonal relationships. So she took out a lot more and harder on Christopher than even on Christina. He had served in Vietnam, was very badly injured, as so many, many soldiers were in that particular war. When he came back stateside, he got married. He'd been married, I think, twice, and he had several children. He'd had a rough period, but he did not, although he'd made a couple of attempts to reconnect with Joan Crawford, they just never found a way to mend that particular relationship. And so when she passed, he didn't really want anything to do with it. And when Christina's book came out, he said that it was very accurate, but he did not write his own book, and he did not try to jump on any kind of Mommie Dearest gravy train. Christina had taken some of the money that she was given for the book as well as the film and given it to Christopher, and it apparently, you know, helped contribute money to him over the years because he'd had injuries from the war and was not able to work. So they had remained close throughout his life. Christina is still alive, and at this point, I think she's around 83.
Oh, wow.
84. You know, she lived for a long time in Idaho, and I think she's in the Spokane area these days in Washington.
Oh.
We'd had a brief email exchange as I was writing this book, and she just basically reiterated her feelings from that long ago conversation that we'd had, where she just felt that it was a missed opportunity. The filmmakers had an opportunity to do a serious film discussing abuse from the point of view of a child. And the movie, as it turned out, was, you know, not taken seriously. And she felt that that was a shame.
Yeah.
And she continues to feel that way.
Okay, it's amazing that you spoke with Christina or had your email exchange or both or either or whatever, but you spoke to a lot of people from the making of the movie, from that,
Yeah, well,
which is so incredible.
You know, a lot of times when, you know, let's say Entertainment Weekly goes to the set of a movie and writes their article on, you know, the making of the current Marvel classic or whatever, they'll always talk to the headline stars.
Mm-hmm.
With Mommie Dearest, that would be Faye Dunaway. Faye, I did reach out to Faye's agent, but I did not expect to hear back, and I didn't, and that was fine. But I just simply gave them the heads up, letting them know I was writing this book. And, you know, if Ms. Dunaway so chose, I would love, obviously, to either request a brief interview with her, or if she had something, a statement to say, I would be more than happy to relay it or whatever. She has since addressed Mommie Dearest with the very recent documentary that has just come out on her life and career. And, but because I had worked in talent agencies, I had access to a lot of people, actors and actresses who were in smaller supporting roles in the movie, production staff members, set, you know, people on the set, the production assistants, the cameramen, the props people, because nobody really seeks them out. Nobody really talks to them, and they usually have the best stories. And I'm very privileged and pleased that so many of them were kind enough to share their thoughts and feelings on the movie, their memories of working on the set with me for the book. And I think that's one of the selling points of my book, is that I was able to reach so many people and kind of interweave their perceptions and what they witnessed, and just their overall feel for the whole thing. You know, nobody sets out to make a flop. Nobody sets out to make a film that, you know, they all want a film that will become a classic, not necessarily a camp classic.
Mm-hmm.
So you never know what you're going to get when you approach somebody saying, hi, I'd like to talk to you about your work on this notorious movie that's one of the most notorious movies of the later 20th century. Most of them have worked on plenty of other things, so for them it was no big deal. For someone like Faye Dunaway, who, you know, she's the very face of it, and if the movie sinks or swims, they're going to blame her for it either way. And that's kind of unfair. She did give a scenery chewing performance, but that's what the part called for. And that's the way she was directed by director Frank Perry, which production assistant Jonathan Zimbert confirmed with me, because I'd asked him about particular, you know, there's one particular scene in the movie that's actually kind of ludicrous, if you've ever seen the movie, where Joan Crawford, as played by Faye Dunaway, is presented with her new baby daughter, Christina, and she takes the child and she carries her up a staircase. And when she reaches the landing, she turns to face the cameras, cradling the child, framed against these arched windows that create a halo effect. And she's just basked in the glow from the, you know, the window, the lighting from coming through the window. And it looks like this religious painting. And you burst out laughing because you think, who does that in life? I guess a 1940s movie star does. But it looks silly when you see it on screen. It's a great image. It would have been fabulous as the movie poster or as a photograph or a magazine layout, but it just looks silly on screen. And I asked Jonathan Zimbert, who was one of the Frankie Blonz's assistants, what were they thinking? And he said, director Frank Perry had a very operatic view of this story. He saw it as a larger than life story, and that's what he was directing Faye Dunaway to do. He kept whispering to her, this is Medea. You are Medea. And so she was playing Medea on that level, you know, as if it were Maria Callas, you know, performing at La Scala, you know. So it was a very heightened theatrical idea for the movie. And it kind of makes sense when you think, okay, this was Christina's entire world, this Hollywood amazing life, everything larger than life, because that's the way children see things. But to a movie audience, it just did not quite come across the way it was intended.
So in your travels and studies and research, what was your big like, oh wow, what? Like what were some of the highlights of your research?
Well, it's very interesting because the overall question that I had asked myself, and so many people asked, is how did this movie that had everything going for it, an A-list star, A-list director, A-list budget, top-notch set production design, costumes, the hairstyles, everything, based on a best-selling book, it was a message picture. How did this movie that had everything going for it turn out to be such the off the rails train wreck that it has come to be seen as by so many people? And I do feel that I have answered the question in the book. And because I was able to talk to so many people who worked on it, I think I've kind of figured out the different areas. You can't lay the blame on one person. As much as people want to blame Faye Dunaway or director Frank Perry, you can't lay the blame in one place. There were a lot of elements that come together to craft any motion picture, and any motion picture has the potential to become a bona fide hit classic film or a huge commercial or critical failure, or possibly a very popular film that nonetheless is viewed, a certain way. They're not all The Sound of Music or The Wizard of Oz, but sometimes they're going to turn out to be, Valley of the Dolls or Mommie Dearest. And sometimes as a filmmaker or person connected with films, you have to give the movie permission to find the audience it's going to find, and to give it permission, as with a child, to experience its own life and be okay with it. Not take it too seriously. You may have a child that grows up to become a concert pianist, or becomes a porn star, or becomes a Christian missionary, or becomes a Republican, or becomes a Democrat, or becomes a Marxist. Whatever that child turns out to be, you have to love that child unconditionally and give him or her permission to explore the world and
Yeah.
take whatever route they're going to take to become the adult, responsible adult that they're going to eventually grow into. The same with a film or with a book. You have to give it permission to reach out to its audience. Its audience is going to find it, and it may not necessarily be the audience that you yourself chose for it. When Mommie Dearest was released, it was early on embraced by the gay community. A lot of gay men identified with the movie, flocked to the movie, because it was about a Hollywood movie star, and the gay community is known for loving their movie stars and Hollywood glamour and all of that. But also a lot of, and I talked with a number of gay men about this, a lot of gay people, as well as gay women, people in the LGBTQ LMNOP communities, have felt themselves either abused or in some way dealing with tenuous relationships, whether it was familial parental relationships or relationships with siblings, whether it was at school with their peers, whether it was on the job with their coworkers, or whether it was at their respective churches with church elders or other congregational members of the congregation. So I think there are certain elements of the story that a lot of people have identified with, again, because of that abuse. Even if you yourself were not abused, you might have still felt bullied on some level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a result, that's one reason a lot of people identify with this movie or gravitate toward it.
You know what I'm thinking of when you and you mentioned the gay audience and why and all of that in the book, but as you were talking about it just now, I just keep thinking of, and by the way, when you're lifting this, because your background's blurred, we can't see it, but I have it, so it's fine, and I can put a graphic. I should have told you earlier, I'm sorry, but I keep thinking of this picture, and I'm thinking about in the book how you talk about all of her wigs and hair pieces and how she moved her eyebrows up and all of these things, and she comes as an already packaged template for drag. She's ready to go.
She should have won the
shoulder
award for
pads.
most like a drag queen performance. Well, the real Joan Crawford is the one who originated those styles. Costume MGM Studios costume designer Adrian had given Joan Crawford early on the, padded shoulders because in real life she had a very solid athletic build. She was slim and she was a gorgeous, sexy woman, but she nonetheless had this physical type. So he crafted the costumes to kind of emphasize or disguise, whichever, those attributes. And as the years progressed, as often happens, Joan Crawford kind of leaned into those particular, now seemingly outre designs. And of course, lots of drag queens have zeroed in on that, doing the eyebrows, thick eyebrows, and the very 40s, 50s hair pieces and all this kind of stuff. If you're into drag, it's fun to play with. If you're not into drag, but simply into fashion, it's glamorous to look at, or it's very show busy. You look
Showbiz.
at
I mean,
any
it's very,
Vegas
yeah,
floor
everything's
show.
very big and exaggerated.
Yeah,
Big hair,
exactly.
big makeup, big costume, big, everything
Exactly.
big.
I
Yeah.
think that I think that's why so many drag performers do people like Madonna or Cher or Lady Gaga or Beyonce, because they do the big costumes, the big outre set
Yeah.
hair and costume design. And
Spectacle.
a spectacle, exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
it's fun. It's visually interesting. It's better than, looking at the J.C. Penney's catalog, I suppose.
That's true. What's next for you, by the way, with the book and everything else? Just what's going on next?
Well, Chicago Review Press is my publisher for With Love, Mommie Dearest. Contractually, they have the right of first refusal for my next book. There are a couple of things that I have already done pre-prep work for and actually already started doing interviews for, which I'm still waiting for them to decide what it's going to be. But either way, the books that I've been doing research for are going to come out one way or the other. It just depends on what's going to come out through them first versus, come out at a later date. I'm not really at liberty to say, but I will say particular popular movies, again, similar to this, the making of a popular kind of a cult classic movie, that nonetheless I'm able to kind of examine the socio-political ramifications and messages within its text, the screenplay, as well as what you see on screen, and as well as what was going on at the time of filming and how it's viewed today. So that
Mhm.
seems to be my MO at the moment.
All right. You just finished your book tour?
I'm still doing it.
Still
I'm
on
actually
it.
going
Okay.
back to the Midwest in another month and a half, going to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to the Literati bookstore, date yet to be determined, going to Chicago, doing some events there, as well as at Columbia College, my alma mater, doing stuff in Peoria at a couple of bookstores there. Peoria, Illinois, as well as other places still being kind of hammered out.
I love
So
that.
I'm still selling the book, still promoting the book, and hopefully people are still, finding something worthwhile in it.
Yeah, it's really great and it flows really well. Like you said, you intertwine a lot of stuff and it's like you did it expertly. Yeah, I really enjoyed it and I loved it. There was something. Oh, how I've obviously never written a book before. How long did it take you to write this?
It probably took about 3 years. I
Yeah.
started the book at the tail end of the COVID lockdown. So I wasn't even able to physically go into the Margaret Herrick Library, which is run by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The production files on Mommie Dearest are kept there. And normally, under normal circumstances, I would be able to make an appointment, go essentially rifle through the files, have the librarians copy anything, or I'd be able to make notes from certain things. I had to do everything relay with the one librarian archivist that was on duty at the time in the library once a week. So it was a difficult process in that regard. But that also forced me by circumstance to kind of, okay, seek out other ways to obtain information on the movie. And that's when I just started cold calling people who'd worked as production staff members, who worked as actors in some of the smaller supporting roles, who worked on the crew. And, 43 years ago, a number of people have passed. A lot of them have retired. A lot of them are still in the business and still working.
That's amazing. That's like the fact that this took place so long ago and you were able to talk to so many people is another amazing thing about it.
Yeah, yeah. I feel very privileged with that. And I was able to track down a number of people, like, for instance, the two women, Jeannie Epper and Sherry Peterson, who had worked as stunt women in the scene in which, Faye as Joan and Diana Scarwood as Christina go at it and have this really ugly fight scene in the middle of the living room. There's a particular stunt where they come crashing through a glass coffee table and crystal lamp and so on. I spoke with and was able to interview the two stunt women who performed that stunt, and they talked about what it was like on set. And, again, these scenes in the movie are very violent when you watch them. You can laugh at some of the, again, unintentionally hilarious, camera angles or funny dialogue in the screenplay. But you watch some of these scenes and it's pretty graphic and it's pretty, especially for a kid, pretty savage stuff. So I was very pleased that I got to talk with the people who were responsible for making it look as convincing as it was, about what the circumstances were of the filming and how it was treated on set, and ultimately how it has been viewed in the finished cut of the movie. Both stunt women were very pleased with the way the stunt turned out. They thought it looked pretty good on screen. And I have to agree.
How can people find you?
I have a website that's still under construction. It's so sad, but I'm on Facebook. The book actually has a Facebook page. With Love, Mommie Dearest has its own Facebook page. For that matter, Match Game 101 has its own Facebook page. And I personally am on Facebook. It is under Ashley Hoff because Facebook would not allow me to have an A period Ashley Hoff. They didn't like the initial there. I guess they thought I was a drag queen or something. So so it's Ashley Hoff on Facebook. On Instagram, it is AA Hoff, which is the word double, DOUBLE, single letter A, Hoff, HOFF. And that's me on Instagram. I suppose if you type in A Ashley Hoff, I'll probably pop up somehow.
Yeah.
And
I'll put everything in the show notes too.
Yeah,
I'll put all your links and stuff.
And eventually I have a website that's coming together, again, under construction. I'll just blame Mercury in retrograde for all my computer failing.
Do it.
It's a very Los Angelino thing to do.
Exactly. I was going to say we're in LA, so that goes. And I know I listen to it on Audible because I'm addicted to freaking Audible. And I got this at your launch, and I left before you signed up. And I know I'm going to see you again, so I'll bring it next time I see you. But yeah, so people can find it on Audible and everywhere, and so there's all of that.
They can find it on Kindle. And I will say this: I'm never going to chastise anyone for buying from the obvious international online purveyors of books. But I will say, whenever you can and whenever you can afford to do so, support your local indie brick and mortar mom and pop bookstores, because they are in fact the backbone of this nation, working very hard to keep America literate. Definitely, when you can, buy my book or other books that you choose to purchase from legitimate indie bookstores.
And for Angelinos, go to Book Soup because that place is dope.
There are a lot of indie bookstores here, surprisingly. There's Chevalier's on Larchmont. There is Skylight Books in Los Feliz. There's Stories in Echo Park. And there's Book Soup in West Hollywood on the Sunset Strip. So
What's the name
I'm
of the
sure
one
everybody...
downtown? The Last Bookstore?
The Last Bookstore, yeah, in downtown LA. But there are indie bookstores all over the country, even if you live in, Ann Arbor, Michigan, go to Literati. If you're in Chicago, go to Unabridged Bookstore. There are so many bookstores out there. Seek them out, please,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
find a good book to read, including mine.
yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, if the world, if America needs anything, I think it needs more literacy. So
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
good tip. And if bookstores are helping with that, then
Yeah.
go on, go all. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I loved every minute of it. I love the book. People who haven't seen the movie in a long time revisit it and then read the book after so that you can you'll have all of the visuals in your head and everything, like the costumes and all that, right?
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
All right, goodbye, everybody.